sector? Well, I, I I will define it as the people who want to combine their religious identity with Zionist identity. And when I speak people who want to combine, I really mean that uh, the uh, the um, the desire to be both Zionist and religious, the psychological desire is, from my perspective, is coming before the ideological explanations for such combination. The ideological explanations are coming just after the desire, after the willingness of being both religious and Zionist. As Karl Marx said, the consciousness is really shaping the ideology, your thinking, the biography, and also not only the personal biography, but the social and sectorial biography is also shaping the ideology, and that is the reason why in we see from time to time ideological changing among people, the individuals and sectors. We see it because there are social changes, and those social changes also shape reshape identity. So um, that combination between religion and Zionism, now maybe many people see it as perfectly understandable. But when it started at the beginning of the 20th century, exactly 1902, when Rabbi Reines established the Mizrahi movement, it was not so obvious, so understandable. The ultra-orthodox, the real ultra-orthodox, attacked the new movement of Mizrahi, and from their perspective, it was not it was illegitimate to forgive me for my English. My English is not perfect, I know, but I'm a Sabra, so I was born in Israel, and I don't have an English excellent English as a American or somebody who make Aliyah from England. So I apologize from the beginning. So as at the beginning of the 20th century, it was not so, as I said, it was not so understandable. The ultra-Orthodox attacked the Zionist movement theologically because their perspective was that we shouldn't build or re-establish the Jewish sovereignty before the Messiah comes. This was the theological claim, but mostly because of halachic attack that we shouldn't make a cooperation with secular people, with people who break all the religious way of life. And so it was really a new phenomena. And but it's also important to define this combination of religious and religion and Zionist identities with the identity of what people in the US call modern Orthodox, because modern Orthodox is based on combination of orthodoxy and modernity, religion and modern liberal life. But religious Zionism built upon combination of two different pillars. One is the religious pillar, which is common, but the other is the national religious pillar. And we see for example, in Israel, that the religious Zionist sector includes also what we called an ultra-orthodox Zionist, what we called in Hebrew. I don't know if you know the word in Hebrew. It's an acronym called Hardalim. Hardalim means Haredim Leumiyim, ultra-orthodox nationalist or Zionist people. Um, because and they are an important part of religious Zionism and this sector, because as I said, the combination of religious Zionism is between the national pillar and the religious pillar, and they also combine those pillars, those ultra-orthodox Zionists. But modern orthodoxy is a combination, as I said, of religion and modernity and liberal perspective, and this is a different combination. But it is not an occasion that there is a lot of fitness between those sectors, the religious and religious Zionism and modern Orthodox, because the people who adopted the Zionist identity, they did it because of modern perspective of life, because they understood that you can't live in the 20th century without this modern nationalist identity, as other nations came to be made their own national movements. So those people who already adopted a modern principle of modern nationality, modern national sovereignty, were really most of them were really open to the idea to adopt another modern pillar of identity, which is the modern liberal identity. So it is not there is no 100% parallel lines between modern Orthodox and religious Zionism, but we really see that most of the religious Zionists are also modern Orthodox, and most of the modern Orthodox are also religious Zionists. So there is a lot of similarity, at least, if not parallel lines. So about the sector itself. In Israel, there was a very important survey about the religious Zionist sector, which was made on 2014, 6 years ago. So it is not so ancient survey by the Israel Democracy Institute. And in this survey, the result was that the religion includes something like 11% of the Jewish population of Israel, which means something like 750,000 people, 3/4 of a million people. This something like it. Of course, it's not exact numbers, and this sector is divided to three main parts, to three main internal divisions: two ideological groups and one mainstream. The ideological groups are, on one hand, the ultra-orthodox Zionists, which are I can say that these are the people who combine, who combine only the national or the national slash Zionist pillar and the religious pillar in their identity. Only pillars of identity. And the other parts of the national religious of the religious Zionist sector combine three pillars of identity: the religious, the Zionist, and the modern slash liberal identity. This is the main difference between the ultra-orthodox part of the religious Zionist sector and the other parts of this sector. So the Orthodox Zionists are something like 12 to 15% of the sector, which means something like 100,000 people. On the other hand, there are the people who define themselves formally as liberal religious people, which include something like 24% of the sector, which means something like 200,000 people. And the other parts of this sector, something like 2/3 or 60% to two-thirds of the sector, something like 450,000 people, are define themselves as basically religious Zionists, or what we called as sociologists, we call them the mainstream, or the bourgeois majority of the sector. The people who don't have a formally defined ideology like the liberals and the ultra-orthodox Zionists. They live their lives as religious Zionists. They don't so much define themselves between those two ideological groups, and those two ideological groups really want to influence them, this mainstream. The main aim of the two ideological groups is to influence the identity and behavior of this majority of mainstream religious Zionists. And what I can say about this mainstream part is that in their daily lives, they really behave like the liberals. They consume liberal culture, secular journalism, cinema, theater, etc., etc., and they live in, as opposed to the ultra-orthodox Zionists. They support the idea of equality between men and women, and the social lives which includes together men and women, not by separation like the ultra-orthodox. And but so by these daily lives behavior, daily lives customs, they are more similar to the liberals. But when they look upon education, to educate their children, many of them, because of a fear of secularization of their children, send their children, the children of the bourgeois mainstream religious Zionists, send their children to more religious, more frum schools, more frum, even as opposed to as compared to their own way of life. And they do it because they see those schools as something like of a vaccine. Now it's a popular word, vaccine. Yes, So they look upon it as a vaccine towards the fear of secularization of their children. So they really text is something like, we, the adults, we made our identity. We already made our identity. We already made the balance between the religious pillar and the liberal pillar within our identity. But we are afraid about our children. Because we are afraid about our children, especially we're afraid that they will be secularized. So we will send them to more religious schools that as a vaccine, as I said, against secularization. Sometimes their children so impressed by those schools that they keep their own this ultra-orthodox Zionist identity, even not only as a vaccine, but this stay as their own identity for all lives. But in most times, those children acted in their identity more from their house and their parents than their schools. And also, I should also add that many people uh, inside the religious science sector and even outside this sector are afraid that the people of the ultra-orthodox Zionist will take the whole sector, because most of the rabbis of the religious Zionist sector are ultra-orthodox Zionists, and even many of the teachers are members of this group, of this secondary group of the sector. So many people fear that because their positions in rabbinical and educational systems of the sector, they will really affect the whole young generations, new generations of youngsters. I must say that I'm not a, a, a partner of these fears, because as I see, most of the people, even most of the people who educated in a ultra-orthodox Zionist form, when they become adults, the socialization of their lives in the general Israeli society is more affecting their life than the education they got in the ultra-orthodox educational system. Most of them, when they come to the army, when they come to the universities, when they come to the work field, they really adopt themselves to those positions, and they not affected by their pre-educational system. And as you see, also the percentage of the ultra-orthodox Zionism within the sector is not rising within the years. So this percentage of, as I said, 12 to 15% of the sector is stable for many years. So I think a proof that most of the people, even those, as I said, who were educated in the in the ultra-orthodox Zionist schools, when they become adults and start to participate in the general Israeli society, they are no longer so ultra-orthodox people. So I hope I made this short preface. understandable for you and you learn something. And Paul, please, your questions.
Sure. So firstly, thank you for answering and also giving me time to sort out this camera problem. I hope now
Yeah,
everyone can now.
we see you very well now.
Right, I'm no longer a disembodied voice. Okay, so one thing that I think is we should definitely discuss is also the political aspect, right? Because last week we were talking about the Haredim, and obviously there's a very specific political agenda centered around two particular parties in the Knesset that have very specific requests and demands from whichever coalition they're sitting in. With the religious Zionist community, I think it's not so clear cut, but there is a clear political agenda which is attached to the religious Zionist community, whether or not, and you can talk about this, but whether or not everyone who defines themselves as religious Zionist signs up to this, but there is that political agenda of a generally right-wing, generally focused on or believing very much in the settlement project in Judea and Samaria, and formerly Gaza, of course. Is that, to what extent is that, would you say that's been stable over time since it got going in the 1970s? Is there been a decrease, an increase in that sort of political side of the community?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question, and I think it's something which is connected to a very important principle that we should understand about this sector. Many researchers, especially this researcher which I quoted before of the Israel Democracy Institute in 2014, and you can find it the whole research at the website of the IDI. The result of those researches was that the main identity pillar of this sector is not the religious pillar, but the national Zionist pillar. This is very important to understand. Although people define themselves as religious, Zionist religious, but when you come to ask them, more deeper questions about their identity, you find that the national / Zionist identity is much more important than their religious pillar. What are the proofs for that? First of all, almost most of the people of this sector, something like 85 to 90% of the people who are who define themselves as religious Zionist define themselves as right-wing people in their political perspective. And when you oppose that to their religious attitude, and religious identity, you see that when we speak about the religious identity, there is a very wide spectrum of religious behaviors among the people of this sector. You see people which are very close to the ultra-orthodox in this sector of Zionist religious sector, and you see also a lot of people who are very close to secular people, also in this sector. You see people who are almost Haredim, almost ultra-orthodox, and you see people who are almost secular. And not only that, the percentage of secularization within this sector is something like 25 to 30% of the youngsters the people who are serving the army and go to the universities. Of course, the army and the university are the main arenas when people change their identity to secular identity, the religious identity. And by that, I mean also that the ultra-orthodox people are right when they are afraid from the army as an arena of secularization, because most of the many percents of the processes of secularization among religious Zionist sector take place in the army. So, but this is a different issue. As I said, there is a lot of secularization within this sector, but as I said, 25 to 30%, but this secularization is not parallel to be a leftist. Many people become very liberal in their Jewish behavior, even, as I said, even secular, but they keep their right-wing identity. It's not parallel, most times at least. And this is very unique. And my explanation for that is that the trauma, the main trauma of the religious Zionist sector is the era in which this sector was very marginal in the Israel, in a general Israeli society, and it was marginal mostly because, of course, it was marginal also because their percents in demography were low, but besides that, it was marginal also because the secular defined the religious Zionist identified at those ancient years the religious Zionist with the ultra-orthodox. They see people with yarmulkes, with observing Orthodox, define themselves as Orthodox, observing the Torah, and they in their revolution against the whole religious Jewish tradition in which the secular, the secular of the beginning of the Zionist revolution, they saw the whole religious identity, not matter ultra-Orthodox or Zionist people, they saw it as something of the past, something of exile lives of Jews. And because of that, they saw, as I said, also the religious Zionist as part of that anachronism. And the trauma of the religious Zionist is that the general Israeli society will not again identify them with the ultra-Orthodox. And so to make this to make sure that this identification will not continue. They built themselves as more nationalists than the old Zionist nationalist secular Zionists. So because of that, at least at the foreseeable future, I don't think they will lose these, they will withdraw or concede this pillar of identity. They will stay as a national, Zionist, and right-wing people, and the spectrum of the religious identity will also be varied to many secondary identities. But the main important pillar of national Zionist and right-wing perspective will stay.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I want to move to the large number of questions that we've received from our participants here. There was a very interesting question about let me just find it here, about the traditional Jews, those who define themselves as traditional, and another question about Mizrahim, Sephardi Jews, and why they tend to vote for, why they are more likely maybe to vote for Shas than for the religious Zionist or religious or right-wing parties. And I want to combine those two questions because I think it's important to spell out, maybe to those in this meeting that aren't familiar with this so much, that we actually had our first speaker in this series, Uri Kedar, who was speaking about secular Jews, made the point that those who define themselves as traditional are often either secular or religious, but because they're Mizrahi, they might define themselves as traditional instead. And I wonder if you can comment on that, and maybe more specifically, the Mizrahi population, the religious Mizrahi population, where does it fit into this? Because I think there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that the Dati Leomi community is an Ashkenazi phenomenon, and that the Mizrahim somehow don't quite fit into that. Even if they share both religious observance and political belief, they're not quite part of it, and they're more likely to vote for, say, Shas than, say, what's now Bayit Yehudi, or what was previously the National Religious Party.
Yes, well, thank you for this question. I think that first I'll speak about the Mizrahi, which is of course very much connected to traditional identity.
Yeah, right.
Also, of course, the relatively new identity of Shas, which is more ultra-orthodox, but traditionally, the Mizrahi people, at least most of them or many of them, were described in Israeli sociology as traditional, which means that many of them can keep a lot of mitzvot, and a lot of traditions. For example, make the usual cliche about Mizrahim is that people who made kiddush at the evening of Shabbat, or even go to the synagogue in the morning, but afterwards they go to the football stadium to see the game, and even go to the stadium by car, not only by foot. Yes. So yet it's important to define these traditional Mizrahim from the conservative and reform movements in the United States. Maybe many of conservative and reform people from the States thought that they can make a covenant with the Mizrahim because they also define themselves as traditional, but it is surely it is not the same. Really, when we spoke before about the questions of 2 or 3 pillars of identity, the national, the religious, and the liberal identities, I think when we speak about the Mizrahi people, most of them at least, adopted also two and not three of the identities, which means they adopted not adopted, they really grew up with national and religious identities, and I can add that in their perspective, at least most of them, of course, we can't anytime we can't at any time speak about the whole sector, about any sector. We can't speak about generally of the whole sector, but and I speak about most of the Mizrahim. I think they also, in their perspective, the national pillar is very much connected to the religious pillar, as opposed to the Ashkenazi ultra-orthodox, who saw the national pillar as something against their religious identity. In the perspective of the Mizrahim, the national Zionist pillar was connected to their religious identity, and their Zionism was not built upon Western secular forms of nationality, but upon the ancient connection between religion and national pillars within Jewish identity. So this is also an important difference, and because of that, many of them were exposed to Western education by friends in North Africa or by Britain in Iraq, but I don't think that most of them adopted the Western culture or the Western values of liberalism as a pillar of ideological identity. They are more open. They are more their religiosity is much more open than the religiosity of ultra-orthodox Ashkenazi, but at least in many times they didn't adopted or they didn't define their openness as a liberal Western principle. And for example, many of those people who go to the football stadiums on Shabbat, and even people who want that the shops on Shabbat will be open. There are a lot of Mizrahim who want that. Yet, when they will see women dancing with a Torah, many of them will think it's crazy, because they are traditional, and this is against tradition. So we didn't see in our homes of our mothers and grandmothers, we didn't see that women dance with Torah. So it's problematic. So as I said, it's so their openness is really a openness of what we use to in our homes, and not so much as ideological principle of liberalism. I hope you understand the difference.
Yeah.
And because of that, most of the Mizrahim are not partners of the conservative and the reform movements, and also I must add that we see in recent years, at least I think even we can speak about before that. There is a lot of anger among Mizrahi religious Zionists against religious Zionist establishment, because, and it's very similar to the anger of Mizrahi seculars against the secular establishment of Israel, the Mapai secular establishment of Israel in the beginning of the state. Why? In those years, the ideology, the main ideology was what we called a melting pot of society. And that Ben-Gurion, he was, of course, the founder not only of the state, but also the founder of this ideology of melting pot. And he wanted that the Jews from all over the world, from 100 countries, will adopt a new Israeli identity. The symbol of that is his demand that people will change their family names when they got a formal position in the government service. Every person who got a formal position in the government service at that years was asked to change his or her family name to an Hebrew one, not an Ashkenazi name or not a Sephardi name, but a new Hebrew name. That was the symbol of the melting pot philosophy, but many during the years, many Mizrahi people said it wasn't a real melting pot. It was an Ashkenazi melting. It was an Ashkenazi identity that you called it melting pot. And also now in recent years, many Mizrahi religious Zionists also claim against the religious Zionist establishment that your identity in the yeshivot, in the synagogues, in the youth movements of Bnei Akiva, and so on, it was not real melting pot. It was an Ashkenazi identity, which you called it melting pot. And this is very parallel, and it's not an occasion it is parallel, because religious Zionism, as I said before, was not only didn't only want to be in a covenant with the Mapai establishment. They really were part of the whole governments of the Mapai governments. They were a secondary partner, but at least a partner. And they adopted also the idea of melting pot, and not only the idea of melting pot, but also the idea that you take an Ashkenazi-based identity and you called it a melting pot. For example, the tefillah among the religious Zionist synagogues and in Bnei Akiva was Ashkenazi tefillah. And many Mizrahi claim now, in recent years, claim against it. They want their own way of tefillah, of praying. So you see this. There's a lot of examples for that. Now, about the after the question about the Mizrahi. Yes, there was an important new phenomena in recent years, especially something like 20 years. So it's not only so recent, 2 decades. We can define a new phenomena of Ashkenazi Masorti. Who are the Ashkenazi Masorti? Most of them are people from the religious Zionist sector who don't want anymore to be committed to the whole Torah, to the whole 613 commandments, and they want to connect themselves to what they like. So they're really Masorti, traditional people, and I think this is a very important phenomena of the creation of an Ashkenazi Masorti community. And for example, many people, even people who you will see them in the street and you will call them secular people, because you won't see a kippah, you won't see women with
head covering.
Head covering, yes. You see them as secular people, but they will call themselves, and other will call them, what we call in Hebrew, datlash. What does mean datlash? A former religious person. But it's important that they don't define themselves as secular, but as former religious, which means that really they are traditional people. And in most cases, they send their children to religious schools because, as some of them say, we want our children to be also datlash and not a secular person. So we want our children to know Judaism. We want our children to practice halacha, to practice Jewish tradition, and they will decide when they will be adults about their way of life. But we don't want to deny their option to be Masorti or even religious.
It's very interesting because I think it gets to if we go back to the basis for this series and Rubi Rivlin's speech, obviously Israeli society is much more complex than just these four tribes, and that's come out in all three speakers that we've had so far, certainly in this talk with you, but I think that you can really see where the president was getting it from when he was looking at the school system, right, the education system in Israel, which is exactly divided into those four streams, right, into secular, religious-Zionist, ultra-orthodox, and Arab. And the question is then, if you don't fit exactly one of these four groups, for example, datlashim, the people you were just talking about, there's no school for datlashim, right? So it's a question of where do you send your kids? Because if you send them to the secular school, then maybe they won't get the religious background that is still important to you, even if it doesn't inform your daily life in the way that it once did. I think that's it's the discrepancy really between the real life of people and the system, which is much more sort of siloed into these four categories. Okay, I want to. Okay, so there's a few very specific questions which I think are very interesting. There's just to go back to the political question. The religious Zionist position on Judea and Samaria, on the West Bank, and specifically the question of annexation, which of course came up this year very much. And the question is the religious Zionist position on annexation, that is generally in favor of it, is it based on historical and biblical rights, or is it more about strategic issues, security issues, national issues, should we say?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said, the main pillar of the religious Zionist sector is the national pillar and not the religious pillar. And also I think the political perspective of the people of this sector is also basically Zionist national and not religious. For example, there was a survey in Makor Rishon, the paper I write for, I think 5 years ago, among religious Zionist people about going to the Temple Mount. Who support going and praying in the Temple Mount? And the result was amazing. 75% of the religious Zionist sector supported the going to the Temple Mount and praying there. But it, of course, this is a real change as opposed to what would be the results if this survey would be made in 1970, 1980. Of course, something has changed. Maybe because of the intifadas, because of as a reaction to the disengagement process. The explanations are not important now. What is more important for our conversation is that when people were asked why you support the going to the Temple Mount and praying there, most of them gave national answers and not religious answers. For example, very few percent support the sentence which said that I want to go to the Temple Mount because build the new temple, the third temple. Few percents, and also few percent support the explanation that I want to go to the Temple Mount because I think that from this area my prayer is being heard better by God.
Closer to heaven, yeah.
Yeah, close to heaven. Yes, because it's more holy.
Right.
Most of the people support the explanation which said, I support the going to the Temple Mount because it can't be that the Muslims and the Arabs have the option to go there and we, the Jews, don't have. So really, this is a national explanation for going even to a very religious act, going and praying in the Temple Mount. But the explanation was a national explanation. So as I said, not only that the national pillar of identity is more important than the religious identity, sometimes the national pillar of identity is really the excuse for some religious behaviors. And when, for example, people who say that we won't obey to rules that to evacuate settlements in Judea and Samaria. Why we want to obey? Because the halacha tells us that, and people quote the Rambam, that when there is a case in which the ruler tell you something and the halacha tell you something different, you should obey the halacha. And because there is, in the perspective of those rabbis, the evacuation of settlements in Eretz Israel are forbidden by halacha, so we won't obey the orders. Yet you can hear those statements from people who are not so much obeying halacha in their regular and daily lives. So you can see that of course, they are religious, but they are very moderate religious in their daily lives. So you see that even when you speak about something that it's considered to be religious, I obey the halacha, and because of that, I won't obey orders to evacuate settlements. The real explanation, the real motivation is really national/Zionist motivation, not religious motivation.
Okay.
And another important thing, yes, that's another important comment, that I think that the concentration of the religious Zionist sector in the national right-wing pillar, I can understand it, but I think to make it as the most important pillar of this sector is really a mistake. And I don't want to claim this statement from a political perspective, not because I'm leftist. I say this statement. I say it because I think the use of the religious Zionist sector is not the right-wing perspective. There are many right-wingers among the Israeli society. When you see the polls, you see that most of Israelis now are right-wingers, or at least centrists close to right-wing perspective. This is not the issue. The issue is that the uniqueness of the religious Zionist sector is really what I said before, the combination between the three pillars of identity: the religious, the Zionist, and the Western liberal identity. And by this really is a microcosmos of the Jewish modern identity all over the world, which also goes between those three pillars: the national/Zionist, the religious, and the Western liberal identity. So really, if the religious Zionist sector would concentrate in this unique combination of identities, of three pillars of identity, it can really become the leader of the whole Jewish world in these days, which, as I said, also goes between those three pillars of identity. And so, and when the religious Zionist sector is concentrating especially on the right-wing perspective, of course, it can't fulfill this this very important mission of leading the Jewish people with these combination of three pillars of identity and balancing between them. So I think it's a very sad situation that, as I said, this sector is concentrated so much in the political arena and not in the cultural and identity arenas.
With your permission, Yair, maybe one more question. Is that okay with you, time-wise?
Yes, okay.
So one more question. I think there's a question here which I think is a nice. I think it's interesting and also relevant to the broader issue of this question of tribes, and to what extent is the Dati Leumi community part of or separate from wider Israeli society. And it's a question about whether there is, the question asks whether there is a glass ceiling on Dati Leumi, religious Zionist soldiers in the army, because they're very prevalent in the officer corps, in combat units. They're wildly disproportionate numbers of combat soldiers, I think, in the IDF from the religious Zionist community. But we haven't yet seen a religious Zionist chief of staff. I think there hasn't been a religious Zionist deputy chief of staff, although maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, deputy was Yair Nave.
Okay, so one, right? But not chief of staff. Has there been some sort of glass ceiling imposed on religious Zionist soldiers? Is there some prejudice somewhere, or it's just been chance?
Yes. I think there is a glass ceiling. Of course, not formal glass ceiling, but practical glass ceiling. I think there is a fear from a religious chief of staff, especially in the army. Not so much because of real fears. I think that if there will be there are some good candidates for that, for that position, but and we should not fear from their religious identity that it will make them to be extreme and so on, because as I said before, the socialization of a person who serves in the army for 30 years before he comes to be a chief of staff is so strong that even if he started his way in a ultra-orthodox school or mechina or something like that, during those 30 years, he will become something very different. So the fear is not real. And I think also in the army, they understand that the fear is not real. Yet, because the fear is strong among many parts of the society, the subjective fear is very strong, and because of that, I think that the army and the politicians command on the army will fear to appoint a religious chief of staff, for example, and because of that, I think even people who are religious or close to religion in their daily lifestyle, when they are high commanders in the army, they will go without a kippah, without yarmulke, because of that. So they will not be identified as religious. For example, the new deputy chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, comes from a religious family, and I don't know him personally, but I hear that he also observes at least traditional, if not religious, lifestyle, and yet he serves without a kippah, so he won't be identified as a religious, and that will be problematic for his possibility to be the chief of staff.
Very, very interesting. Okay, thank you very much, Yair Sheleg, for really informing us with a huge amount of data and detail about the religious Zionist community, which, although small, is certainly very influential beyond its numbers in Israeli political life, I think, and cultural life. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you for you.
I want to just say that we're taking a break from this series next week because we're in partnership with another organization in the United States working towards a big conference happening next year. Hopefully a physical conference here at the Begin Center. We'll see what's going on in the world in May. But certainly it will either be here at the center or virtually a big conference about Menachem Begin and supporting a new documentary being made in English about the life of Menachem Begin. And we have a series of webinars that are going to be taking place on a Wednesday every few weeks. So the first of those is going to be next Wednesday. It's going to be with Dan Meridor, former minister, deputy prime minister, and Malcolm Honline, a leading American Jewish figure, former head of the Conference of Presidents in the United States. That's going to be next week. So the details are going to be on our website, on our Facebook, and those of you on my mailing list will get it from me. And we will resume this series with part 4, looking at Arab Israeli citizens, in 2 weeks with a wonderful speaker, Mohammed Darausha. I recommend that very strongly. So I hope to see you all next week for the Begin event and the week after for the final part of this series. I thank you all. Have a great day, great evening, depending where you are, and farewell. Bye.
Thank you.